I'm Nick Alaimo. I'm going to interview my grandma about the Cold War, ask her some questions about the Cold War, herself, her family, and what she can remember about the Cold War. So let's start off with you, Grandma. What is your name and date of birth?
My name is Lucille Chiesa. I was born on September 12th, 1930, which makes me 81 years old.
Nice. Who are your parents and where are they from?
My parents were Ida and Theodore Delpra. My mother was born in Hoboken, New Jersey, and my father was born in Venice, Italy.
Where were you born?
I was born in Washington, D.C.
How long did you live there for?
Oh, not long, just about 4 months, I believe.
Really?
And then after that, we came up to New Jersey, and I lived in New Jersey until I was 8 years old, and then moved to the Bronx, New York.
And you lived in the Bronx for most of your life, too, right?
Yes, I did, until I was 62 and moved to Lavallette, New Jersey, where I live now.
That's nice. What are the names of your grandparents and where are they originally?
Okay, my grandparents. My mother's parents were Maria and Francis D'Agostin. They were originally from Friuli, Italy, which is the very northern part of Italy near Yugoslavia. They came to the United States in their 20s. My father's parents, Lucille and John Delpra, were from Venice, Italy, and they remained there. The only grandparents alive when I was born was my grandfather, Francis D'Agostin.
Do you remember him?
Yes, I do. I remember him. I guess the last time I saw him, I was about 6 years old.
6 years old.
And then he went back to Italy and then was there during the war and died there, during the Second World War and died there.
All right. Let's talk about something more positive. Let's talk about your childhood friends. Do you remember them?
Oh, yes. I had quite a few childhood friends. We all went to grammar school together, and 3 of them and myself remained friends up to our senior years.
Wow.
Yeah.
What were your interests as a child, and what did you do in your free time?
Well, as a child, I loved listening to the radio. You know, we didn't have TV in those days. And we had a lot of radio programs that were geared to children and to adults, and that was about a favorite listening. And usually on Saturday afternoons, we would go to the movie. You'd see 2 movies, cartoons,
How much would that cost
and a
you?
cereal. Oh, I think it was 25 cents.
25 cents?
Yes.
Wow.
It took up the whole afternoon.
Wow. What did you do in your free time?
In my free time, well, that's one of the things I did on Saturday. And then you'd be out playing in nice weather. It was, as a child, jump rope, roller skating.
A lot of the same things they do nowadays.
Yes, I would say so. We went ice skating in the lake outdoors. And occasionally you'd go to an ice skating rink or a roller rink. But otherwise, most of your activities were outdoors in the nicer weather.
How was your school experience?
Oh, my school was good. I went to PS 7. And
This is in the Bronx?
Yep. 2 blocks away from home. And all the grammar schools at that time went from kindergarten to 8th grade. And you walked to school.
You walked to school?
Yeah, there were a lot of local schools. I don't know that anybody had to walk more than 6 blocks or so to get to school. And everybody was from the neighborhood.
Did you go to public school your whole life?
I went to public school. Yes, I went to Catholic high school for 2 years. But other than that, I went to public school.
What 2 years did you go to your Catholic high school?
My first 2 years of high school.
Why did you leave Catholic school?
Why did I leave Catholic school? I don't know. I just switched over to public school and preferred that. And when you went to grammar school, you walked to school because school was so close to everybody.
Did your mom or dad walk you, or you'd walk yourself?
Well, once you got to like 3rd grade, you'd start walking yourself. But you went home for lunch, and I don't know of anybody that stayed in school for lunch.
Really?
When you
Everyone
went
would
to
go home.
Everybody would go home for
and
lunch.
Come back?
And come back, yeah. When you went to school in the morning and when you returned after lunch, you lined up with your class before you went into your classroom. So in the wintertime, you would line up in the auditorium, and in the springtime, in warmer weather, you lined up in the schoolyard and you would march to your class, with your entire class.
How would you describe your childhood?
I'd say my childhood was happy, easy, safe. You weren't worried about things. You never heard of violence. And everything you needed was within walking distance. Your school, your library, your church, the stores.
You were an only child, correct?
Yes, I was.
Did you like being an only child? You wish you had brothers and sisters?
Well, I was very close with some of my cousins.
Yeah.
And
you have a big
and I
family?
had a lot of friends, yeah.
Big family?
I had quite a few cousins. So I was content.
What were your favorite classes while you were at school?
What were my favorite classes? I would say math and art. And
did you have any favorite teacher that you can remember? Or?
That I can remember. Yeah, I had Mrs. Engel. She was lovely. She was our art teacher and taught us sewing.
Wow.
And in those years, when you reached the 8th grade, all the girls had to make their own graduation dresses under her direction.
Really?
Yes. Wow. Yes, that was quite a project.
Wow. What do you think was different about school then than opposed now?
Well, our schools were smaller, and the students, nobody got driven to school. There was no such thing. There were no school buses, so everything was close by, and because you went to school with the kids that lived within 4 or 5 blocks of you, and so you knew them, and many of the teachers. And one thing that was different, I think, was we didn't have the huge amount of homework that I see children have today. Yeah. You did a lot of your work was taught to you in school. You always have some homework, but not the monumental things that I see that children get today. And school was, there were no outbursts in school. You went to school and you knew you had to obey the teacher. And
kind of like nowadays.
Well, you knew you had to finish your work.
What kind of student were you?
I was a good student. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I was. Yeah.
What do you think shaped your worldview the most?
Probably what I was taught in school and reading. I read quite a bit. Things you heard on the radio. Listening to the radio was an important part of your life, the way television is today for you.
Yeah.
And probably listening to my parents. I think their views shaped a lot of my own.
How would you characterize your generation, and how was it different from your parents' generation and this current generation?
My generation was, I think most of us weren't greedy. We were satisfied with what we had.
Not wanting more?
We had, life had come out of the Depression, so it was uplifting. We weren't wealthy, but most of us were getting along. And I think everybody looked to the future with hope. My generation was different from that of my parents because we didn't have their obligations. My parents' generation, most of them didn't have the opportunity to finish school, to go on to college. They had to leave school at a pretty young age and go out to work and contribute to the upkeep of the family.
So you were the first generation to really go through school?
Absolutely.
And what about this current generation? How do you think it differs?
Well, I think your current generation wants so much more. They're not easily satisfied. And unfortunately, I think they drive themselves to work. I think you have a much harder life than we did. And you don't have much time for, I think you want more material things, and I think you don't have much time left to just enjoy one another.
Not
your family.
Not enough free time is what you're saying.
Right.
You're always going, always doing sports or something. I understand. What cultural influences impacted you the most?
Oh, I would say films in my earlier years, and later on I enjoyed going to the theater, and then of course TV. My husband and I bought our first television set in 1952, the year we were married.
Wow. What films do you remember from back then?
Oh, some of the all-time greats were Gone with the Wind, which was all about the Civil War, and starred Vivian Leigh and Clark Gable, who were big stars in those years. Then another huge film was The Ten Commandments with, what was his name? No, not Walter Houston. I don't remember now his name, although I can visualize him. And then the first movie I ever saw when I was a little girl was Walt Disney's Snow White and Seven Dwarfs.
I think a lot of people saw that movie.
Yes, yes.
Were the TV shows very different?
Oh, they were great. Well, you never saw the violence that you see now.
Yeah.
I watch very little television now. I concentrate on Jeopardy.
Do you watch Jersey Shore?
Oh, God, no, never. I watch Wheel of Fortune, but none of the violence.
No reality TV?
No. But we had great shows, weekly shows. We had, the Mary Tyler Moore Show. We had Dick Van Dyke, his show that was on weekly. We had Danny Thomas's show that was on we had great shows, fun shows that you really enjoyed, showed a lot of family life at that time.
Well, a show that just came out recently was the show Mad Men, and it takes place in the 1950s. Is that similar to like what it was like?
I love it.
You watch that show?
Yes, I do. It's in its fifth. It just started its fifth season, and it is like life in the 50s. The clothing is the same. They
Did they drink the same?
Oh gosh, yes. Watching that brought back memories of life in the 50s, and it was the people in the advertising field on Madison Avenue were known to be heavy drinkers, and of course in those years everybody smoked.
So they didn't really know it was bad for them back then, right?
What did
they didn't know it was bad for them back then?
No, they didn't. No.
Did you smoke back then?
Yes, I did.
You did?
I smoked. Yeah, I smoked for a number of years.
Cigarettes?
Yes. And I finally gave it up, I guess, I don't know, in the late 50s, I think.
Really?
I stopped smoking, yes.
How many years?
My grandfather did too.
Really?
A lot of years, yes.
Wow, that's interesting.
But nobody thought anything of it then.
Let's get back to the topic. What and who really shaped your identity the most?
Well,
who do you remember, really?
Yes, thinking about it, I'd say probably my parents.
Yeah?
Yes, I was an only child, and they were very intelligent, and I admired them, and they taught me good manners, they taught me to be considerate of other people, and they taught me to appreciate the life I have.
So basically they're role models.
Yes, they were. That's the absolute correct thing. They were my role model.
Nowadays, a lot of kids look up to maybe a basketball player or someone that maybe they think is their role model, but really isn't.
Right.
It's important to look up to someone that you know is a really good role model.
That's true.
All right. What were your attitudes towards the Soviet Union, Russia, and communism? Like, for nowadays, we look back and we think of the Soviet Union, Russia, and communism as being bad, and red as being the color of communism, which was terrible. Is that what it was like back then?
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Absolutely.
People feared communism.
Yes, they did fear it. They did fear it very much, and you heard about it on the news programs. We'd always listen to Walter Cronkite, who spoke about it all the time, and it was it worried people
Uh-huh.
hearing about this because it was so different from the things that we believed in, and we wondered how it would affect our lives.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever think that communism would come over to the United States?
I had hoped not. I didn't think it ever could. I
Uh-huh.
couldn't imagine it.
Mm-hmm.
And I certainly wouldn't want it to. I remember a friend of mine visited Russia. I don't remember the year. She went with her parents.
Uh-huh.
And when she came back, she said she was frightened the entire time she was there. She always felt that she was being watched. And
That's
they were
weird.
really... it wasn't a political thing that they went. That was
Mhm.
just curiosity to see the country and the people.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. What were your feelings and reactions towards the experiences with the Cuban Missile Crisis? One of the times, maybe the 12 most nervous days of U.S. history.
It certainly was. We were all so nervous over the fact that the Soviets were building missile bases in Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
It was a clear indication of war.
Did you really think that they were getting ready to bomb the U.S.?
Absolutely,
That was the
absolutely.
feeling
And
back
each
then?
day the news became more and more serious. And you'd tune in and you'd hear Walter Cronkite and other newsmen talking about it, and you thought that within the next hour, the next 2 hours, war could begin. And finally, Kennedy and Khrushchev came to an agreement,
Mm-hmm.
and the war was averted.
But you remember being very scared back then?
Oh, absolutely. Everyone was.
You weren't shielded from the information from your parents?
Not at all. No. Why would I be? No, not at all.
So everyone knew what was going on. How is that how are people able to focus going through the day?
We had no choice. You went on with your life, and everybody was very alert to the fact
That something could
develop.
The
at
world
any
could
time.
blow up.
Yes.
That's scary to know like that.
Yeah.
Going to work.
Yeah.
Do you remember
Certainly
ever going to school and having any drills of what
Well,
would happen?
We had drills when I was in school during the Second World War,
Uh-huh.
where they'd have practice drills, and when
Would
the
you go
sirens
under a
would go
desk?
up, you'd go under a desk.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Stay away
Yes,
from
and you
windows.
say there, yeah. And we would have, and during back in the Second World War, they would have blackouts.
Uh-huh.
And at night, you'd hear the sirens, and then everything would go dark, and you would have to close all your lights. The curtains would all have to be drawn.
Well, why would they do
And,
that?
So that they didn't want, if planes were flying overhead,
Uh-huh.
they couldn't see things by your lights that were on.
You
Everything.
remember practicing this?
Oh, absolutely.
That's scary.
Absolutely. Yes, and at school in those years, ordinarily in the higher classes, your 6th, 7th, and 8th grades always went on school trips once a year. That was canceled.
Really?
They kept you in school for the time that you were doing school, and then you went home, but they never took you any long distances. But that was, in the Second World War.
Mm.
But this was the Cuban Missile Crisis was really, really frightening.
Yes, I bet. Let's move on. What do you think about the assassinations of John F. Kennedy?
What about, and with the Cuban Missile Crisis, did you see that movie?
Oh, the movie
About
12
it?
Days?
Yes.
We saw that movie in school.
Did you?
It was actually very interesting.
Yes.
You saw it too?
Yes, I saw it on DVD,
Mm-hmm.
and it was very interesting, and it seemed very true to life,
Mm-hmm.
and the characters in it. The man that played President Johnson,
Mm-hmm.
I thought could have been President Johnson.
Lyndon
because
Johnson.
he looked, yes, Lyndon Johnson. He looked exactly like him.
Really?
And the only person that I thought was not cast well in that movie was the press secretary at the time, who was Pierre Salinger.
Mm-hmm.
He was a very colorful character. Now, most times, you don't even know the name of the press secretary.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes you do, but most times you don't. But he was very well known, and he was a very colorful character, and he was a big guy, and always smoked this huge cigar, and they used to tease him, and the fellow that played him just looked like a very meek person,
Normal.
and had a very small part in the movie.
But other than that, you think it was pretty accurate?
Oh, I think it was great, yes.
Feelings and
yes,
everything?
absolutely.
It really made you feel how nervous everyone must have been.
Yes, you realized how treacherous it was.
I bet. Let's move on. What about the assassination of John F. Kennedy, president? Seems like a scary time.
Yeah, he was assassinated in, was it 1963?
Yeah.
And I think it was one of the...
Robert Oswald.
Yeah, I think it was one of the saddest days in the history of our country.
Mm-hmm.
Everything stopped. Everyone stayed glued to the TV from the time that he was shot, and they announced it on TV, and all through the time when they announced that he had died, and through the additional days of the funeral and all. That was all anyone talked about and all that anyone watched. And it made you think about what it must have been like at the time that Lincoln was assassinated.
Really
it
brought
kind
back
of
memories,
brought back memories of that. I mean, although I wasn't alive at that time.
What did you think though when you heard about it? Like, what was your first reaction? Because it happened we learned that it happened around 12 o'clock, and mostly the United States found out around 1 o'clock-ish when he was pronounced dead.
Yes. You didn't think it was.
It
was hard to believe, and you were sure he wasn't going to die. He was just shot, and they were going to save him, and it was just. I think everyone was. It affected everyone. Yeah, I can't imagine anybody being able to function well with all that going on.
Do you remember when Robert Oswald was shot? Then 2 days later, when he was in police handcuffs, he was being handed over to the federal police, and then he was shot.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
Yes.
What was your feelings towards that?
People had their televisions on all day.
Yeah.
You know.
Were you surprised? Were you?
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Of course, it wasn't something you expected, and you always wondered about it. You know, if that was actually what the reasoning behind it was. Was it another country that wanted this to happen? And you know,
even nowadays, there's a lot of talk that maybe there was another shooter. Do you believe that, or do you believe it was just Robert Oswald?
I think it's possible. Yes.
So you think?
But it's hard to tell. I mean, the person that did it couldn't have been in their right mind, that's for sure.
Yeah. What about Martin Luther King?
Oh, Martin Luther King.
Great man.
The assassination of Martin Luther King was really a tragedy.
What about it?
Well, I think it was an embarrassment.
Yeah.
To our country. You know, he was a peaceful man.
No violence.
And he always preached nonviolence. And he worked for racial equality, which was very lacking in our country. And it needed to be corrected.
Yeah. You remember his speech, I Have a Dream speech?
Oh,
you remember watching it?
Everybody heard that. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That was so sad. You know, we... living in New York, New Jersey, this section of the country, I don't think you were as aware of how badly black people were treated, because we didn't have much of it up here, you know, or in my years and growing up, I wasn't that aware of it. It didn't seem that bad, but as the way it was in the South, and you would see it on, you know, in films and such, it was so unfair. Did you see a big difference then after? No, I think it was very slow. Yeah. I think it was very slow, and there's still a lot of it. Yeah. There's still a lot of racially, you know. But it was totally different back then. Different bathrooms. Oh yeah. Do you remember having different white people go to different bathrooms? No, not up north. No. No, I never saw that, and the only time I'd see that would be on film, you know, or read about it, or you'd see it mainly in the movies if a film dealt with any of that. But you'd hear about it and you'd read about it, even in sports. Yeah. I mean, before black people were allowed to play baseball, you know, things like that. Terrible, terrible. It's much, much better now. I think there's probably still some, but
nothing like it was.
Oh no. not at all.
What about Robert Kennedy? Do you remember his assassination?
Yes, he was a strong believer in racial equality, and he did a lot of work to achieve, the correction of that. He opposed it. He opposed the Vietnam War. And I believe that had he not been shot and he died the following day, I think he would have gone on to be elected president. And I think he would have done good things.
A lot of people forget about Robert Kennedy when they just look at John F. Kennedy.
Right.
Kennedy.
But Robert Kennedy was a very strong person, and he did a lot. He was very smart. Very smart, as was John F. Kennedy.
Was that the feeling even back then? A lot of people thought that he was very smart.
Oh yes, he was. And they had a lot of smart people in their group working.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive. And that if it were otherwise, Mr. Gromyko went on, the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance, unquote. That statement also was false. Acting, therefore, in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved.
What were your feelings and reactions towards the experiences in Vietnam?
Oh, Vietnam. Our country was so divided over Vietnam, over the war. I, for one, was totally against it. But aside from that, there were whole groups of people, they called them Doves, who wanted an end to the war. And then there was another whole group called Hawks, and they felt that the United States should continue to fight. And let me tell you, many young men fled to Canada to avoid the draft. and it was a horrendous time. And you would see this on television and see all the men who were wounded and killed and carried off the battlefield. It was absolutely devastating.
So you recall watching on the news all the reports about the soldiers dying and
Oh,
watching
absolutely.
videos of them.
Absolutely.
From what I can understand, the communications went up a lot during this time from then to the World War I, World War II. So you actually saw what was going on.
Well, you know, there were reporters assigned to cover the war. They went overseas.
And that was the
and
first
they were
time.
there. Yes, that was the first time we ever saw that because it was all available on TV. And all the networks had big reporters out there traveling with these soldiers. And many of them were killed also and wounded. And they covered the stories, and then we would watch it on TV.
When you were talking about the groups and the Doves and the Hawks, you consider yourself a Dove?
Absolutely.
Totally against the war.
Absolutely. Terrible. I'm always against war.
Divisive military efforts in United States history since the Civil War was the Vietnam War. A subject of widely differing opinions at the time, the controversy rages still today over whether or not America should have involved itself in this bloody and hard-fought conflict. The primary aim of our involvement in Vietnam was to contain the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. Following the events of the Korean War and the Chinese Civil War of 1949, the United States officially backed the anti-communist Republic of South Vietnam against the forces of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam. Received military and economic assistance from the Union of Soviet Social Republics, or the USSR, and the People's Republic of China, Communist China, which greatly prolonged the conflict and created a significantly more difficult obstacle for the U.S. Armed Forces to surmount. What followed was one of the most brutal and unique wars ever fought by America. This course will examine the history of the Vietnam War. It will provide the students with the historical backgrounds that set the stage.
What were your feelings and reactions towards the experiences during the 1960s counterculture?
Oh, that was a wild time. Many young people who call themselves hippies. It was so different from anything else with our young people before. A lot of them went out to San Francisco. That was a big area there. But it was all people who believed in probably no government, free love, peace. That part was fine, but they believed in. They claimed they believed in peace and love, and unfortunately, this involved lots of the introduction of drugs in our country, which were very prevalent among these groups. They dressed really strange and supposedly, weren't very clean, and it was all strange music and
So you weren't taking part in the hippies?
Oh my God, no.
What you remember about it was mostly the drugs?
Yes, and what they looked like when they'd show you pictures on TV. And then, of course, we had a big weekend called Woodstock in Woodstock, New York. that was wild. There were thousands of them there. Went on the whole weekend. They all camped out. And someone told me that they had hired, what group was it? Hell's Angels, that's right. They had hired Hell's Angels for security, so you could know how wild it was.
Yeah, it must have been a crazy party.
It sure was. It sure was.
You remember watching on TV?
Yes. Oh, yes.
All
They had a lot of TV coverage, yes. There were a lot of people out there that got sick, passed out, you know.
All
all
from
of
the
that
drugs and the
stuff.
alcohol.
Yes.
Arguably the most important concert in the history of music. Hi, I'm Rebecca Brayton and welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be learning more about the 3 days of music and peace that were Woodstock. There are many events emblematic of hippies and the counterculture of the 1960s. One of the most important and well-known was the Woodstock Music and Arts Fair. At the time of the event, the United States was steeped in racial discord and military conflict overseas. Woodstock was not simply a music and arts festival, it morphed into a counterculture microcosm. At the outset, hippie rock promoters Michael Lang's and Artie Kornfeld's vision was for an isolated recording studio planted in the middle of a forest. John Roberts and Joel Rosenman were instrumental in the evolution of the idea from studio to outdoor concert, but were also the money men behind the event. Since Woodstock cost well over $2 million to put on, these venture capitalists were important. The event was held on a 600-acre dairy farm owned by Max Yasgur in Bethel, New York from August 15th to the 18th, 1969. The land was a perfect natural venue. The stage was set at the bottom of a hill, allowing viewers sitting far away to at least catch a glimpse of the performers. At the bottom of the slope was a pond, which became a popular place for skinny dipping. While the event was opposed by local townspeople from the get-go, eventually legal problems were solved and planning went ahead. Engineering a sound system for the event was another huge hurdle. Finally, a solution was set in place for a potential crowd of 150 to 200,000. Little did the organizers know actual attendance numbers would more than double their estimates. Massive crowds descended on rural New York the day of the festival, causing huge traffic jams. Even some of the acts scheduled to play the festival were caught up in the traffic and ended up being unable to play. Originally, Woodstock was not meant to be a free event. 186,000 tickets were sold beforehand, and organizers only anticipated about 200,000 people would show up in total. When it became apparent that they were way off in their estimations, the fence surrounding the event was ceremonially cut down. This step helped solidify the event's vibe of peace, love, and inclusiveness, and also caused a lot more concertgoers to show up. In total, about 500,000 people were in attendance at Woodstock. Meanwhile, mainstream media wanted to report the worst about the festival. The event took place on an extremely hot weekend. Torrential rain transformed the event site into a giant mud puddle, drug use was rampant, and the presence of unsanitary conditions and food shortages were all angles they wanted to play up. Ironically, many sources today cite the amount of drugs consumed at the event as the reason for a lack of violence. And considering the massive amount of people in attendance at the 3-day event, there were remarkably few serious problems. No violent crime was reported, a few deaths took place, all of which were accidental. However, on a happier note, Woodstock is also said to be the setting for 2 births. And then there was the music. Despite the 4 promoters' relative inexperience, they were able to book some of the most important acts of the day. 32 musicians and groups played at the event, including legendary performances by The Who, Janis Joplin, Joe Cocker, and Jimi Hendrix, to name only a few. This took a great amount of money, and the promoters were virtually bankrupted by the event. However, they retained the movie rights, and the 1970 documentary Woodstock more than made their money back. The Woodstock Music and Arts Fair is considered by many a symbol of the age of innocence, when young citizens from all walks of life and varying political associations got together and simply enjoyed music. It has gone down in the annals of rock and is arguably a turning point in the 20th century. There is some debate as to its place in history books, but some will simply remember it as the party of a lifetime.
What were your feelings and reactions towards the experiences during the Civil Rights Movement?
Well, it wasn't until 1964 that the Civil Rights Act was passed. And even then, it was opposed by the Southern Democrats. And it continued to happen. There was a lot of inequality. There still is some. Living in the Northeast, we weren't as aware of how badly blacks were treated and things that weren't free for them to participate in as white people. The only time we saw anything here in the Northeast was when schools were desegregated. Then the difference here was that our children could not go to the local schools. They were assigned to various schools and had to be bused because they wanted to integrate the schools and have equal numbers of blacks and whites in each school rather than a black school and a white school.
So that's where your kids went to school, with the blacks and the whites?
Yes, they did. Yes, they did.
And it worked out good?
And they had to travel. Well, it wasn't the same as being in school close by, but it.
How old were your kids when this happened?
Oh, I can't remember.
They were in high school?
But it didn't make that. Yes, in high school. Yes, yes.
So that's really when you start to see how bad the blacks were
Then
being
we were
treated.
more aware of it. Yes, yes.
And how bad it was in the South.
Yes, and of course you'd see it on the news.
But you never could.
But it didn't occur, in your neighborhoods. At least not the neighborhoods that I lived in.
What about the end of the Cold War? What were your feelings and reactions?
Well, the biggest part, what ended the Cold War basically was when they tore down the Berlin Wall. That divided East and West Berlin. And, of course, the West believed in democracy and the East was communism. And this coming down signified also the end of the power that the Soviet Union had. And this happened at the time of the presidency of Ronald Reagan. So he was given credit for this and is always remembered for that.
So it was a great time of optimism.
Absolutely.
Do you remember it happening? It was great.
I remember seeing it on television.
Was everyone a lot happier?
Yes, it was a lot on. Yes, they publicized it a lot. It was because it was a big event.
People didn't have to live in fear anymore.
Yes, and they could travel back and forth between East and West Berlin. Families were split up. Some of them had lived on the east side, some on the west.
So it wasn't only just a big deal in the United States, it was also a big deal
Oh, it was
there.
wonderful for Germany. And yes, for the world.
For the world.
Martin Luther King, Jr. I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society. and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize the shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time.
Was there any particular president you admired or respected the most?
Well, I would have to say John F. Kennedy. I thought he was just wonderful. He was a war hero. He was brilliant. And he surrounded himself with great minds. And he listened to people's advice and then made his decisions. And I admired him for a lot of reasons. One of the main things that I think he did, which is still in existence today, was that he was instrumental in starting the Peace Corps. And that was wonderful.
Do you like all Kennedys or just particularly John F. Kennedy?
Well, I would have to say I knew the most about him because he was the president. And I guess I knew a lot about Robert F. Kennedy, who I also admired. Mm-hmm. And family, unfortunately, had a lot of tragedy in their family, but they also did a lot of good, the children and the grandchildren.
Was there any particular president you felt failed the American people?
Oh, yes.
Who's that?
Can you guess who it is?
I'll let you tell me.
It was President Nixon.
Nixon?
I was very disappointed in him. He always seemed... Maybe he wasn't that way, but he always seemed so arrogant. Mm. He was always so critical of the press. Mm. And I felt he wasn't honest, and especially after the Watergate tapes came out, I think you just couldn't trust him. That's it. It was very sad, but I don't think, and ultimately he resigned presidency.
I think a lot of people feel that way.
Yeah, I think so.
How do your children differ from you?
How do my children differ from me? I don't really feel that they do differ from me. Talking with them and seeing how they act, I feel that we have the same values.
Mm-hmm.
I think we respect one another. And I think we know we can count on one another. I admire them. I think they're honest. And I think they're good people and that they try to help others. And that's very important in this life.
You said you have 2 kids,
Yep.
Susan and John.
Yeah, John's the older and Susan's the younger one.
If you had
who
a
is
pick,
your mother.
it's true. I think she's a good mother too.
Yeah.
But if you had to pick, which one would be your favorite? Would it be Susan or John? I mean, you could tell me. I won't tell nobody. You
No,
tell Mr. Shaw, too.
I know. You can't. You can't choose a favorite child or a favorite grandchild. You love them
I'm
all.
your favorite grandchild.
At times you get angry with one or the other of them, or you're disappointed, or you're very proud. But I've been very fortunate. I have 6 wonderful grandchildren. And
the youngest is the best, I heard. But that's just what
Yeah.
I heard.
You're funny, Nick. That's because you're the youngest.
What are the positive and negative changes in American society since your childhood?
Well, there's a lot of them. There's on the side of the positive, I think men and women today have a better working relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I think years ago you only assumed that women's work was in the house,
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't have the mind or the education, which maybe years ago they didn't, but now they all pretty much have the same, have college degrees and go on from there. And so I think they're equal, and I think that's how their jobs are. And as far as that's one thing that I think is good, and there's a lot of things. There's, let's see, I didn't go on a plane until, I must have been in my 20s.
Wow.
And today, I mean, my grandchildren traveled at a very early age. You've traveled all over. My children have traveled all over. I've been to not that many places, but I also have traveled, which you didn't hear of people doing
It's
that
good.
years
You
ago.
get to see a lot more of the world.
And then, of course, communications are so different. We had one telephone in the house.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, there was no such thing as cell phones.
What about texting?
Oh, forget it. And I
Yeah.
still don't.
I need to teach you how to do that.
Yeah, and we didn't have computers, so this is, these are all positive things, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And on the negative side, well, I think people are required to work so much longer, so much harder, that their life is consumed
hours.
with their work,
Mm-hmm.
and it takes away from family time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sad. And I think there's also the changes where years ago, most families lived close to one another, at least in the same state.
Yeah.
But then, I guess in the 50s, maybe the 50s, your job started transferring people, and if they wanted to hold on to their job, they had to leave. So now, you may have brothers and sisters living clear across the country.
Let's go with the communications though, and the new phones and
Right.
airports, so you get to talk to them and see them now.
You get to talk to them, yes, frequently, but you're not able to get together as often.
It's true.
About the Watergate break-in, Americans stopped what they were doing on August 8th, 1974, to stare at their TV sets and watch the first president of the United States resign his office.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of this nation. Each time I have done so to discuss with you some matter that I believe affected the national interest. In all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected. In the past few days, however, it has become evident to me that I no longer have a strong enough political base in the Congress to justify continuing that effort. As long as there was such a base, I felt strongly that it was necessary to see the constitutional process through to its conclusion, that to do otherwise would be unfaithful to the spirit of that deliberately difficult process and a dangerously destabilizing precedent for the future. But with the disappearance of that base, I now believe that the constitutional purpose has been served, and there is no longer a need for the process to be prolonged. I would have preferred to carry through to the finish, whatever the personal agony it would have involved. And my family unanimously urged me to do so. But the interests of the nation must always come before any personal considerations. From the discussions I have had with congressional and other leaders, I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. For more than a quarter of a century in public life, I have shared in the turbulent history of this epoch.
What do you think about the current and the future state of the U.S. and in the world?
Well, I really think that the United States will remain a superpower. And hopefully we'll all learn to live in peace so that we can survive.
Without war.
Exactly. What do you think?
I think you're right. I hope you're right. I think a lot of people would agree.
I think so.
What are things you worry about with that?
Oh, I worry about all kinds of things. Don't forget, I'm an old lady and I have a lot of free time to worry. So I worry about the health, safetyness, happiness of my children and grandchildren. I fear nuclear war. I hate violence. And I always pray for financial security of my family, that nobody... I don't think anybody has to be wealthy. You would just like to be able to have food on your table and clothes on your back and a decent life.
On the other hand, what are things you're optimistic about?
Well, I'm optimistic about the future of the world. I believe most people realize that in order to survive, we've got to put aside all our grievances and work together.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any regrets?
Yes. I regret that I didn't become a nurse.
Really?
Growing up, I thought I wanted to become a nurse, and I think I would have been a good nurse. And I'm sorry I didn't pursue it.
Mm-hmm.
I should have.
What did you pursue instead of that?
Oh, well, I was a medical assistant, so I worked in doctor's offices and dentist's office, but I think I would have liked to be a nurse and work in a hospital, yes.
It's always time.
Oh!
Sorry. There's always time to go back in school.
Oh, yes, at 81 I'm going back to school. Thank you.
What wisdom would you pass on to future members of your family?
To future members? Always. What I always tell all of you. Be kind to one another. Be honest. You must be honest. Honesty is very important. And love your family and always be good to one another.
Love your family. It's something important that everyone should know.
Yes, it is. It is. It's very, very important.
Some people need to learn that lesson more than others.
That's true. That's true. Some do. Some really feel that way. They just don't express
Some
it.
have a weird way of showing it.
Yes,
too.
they do.
Sometimes with being angry, criticizing.
That's
A
true.
lot like a brother would do. Someone like a Peter, not saying names.
I think
or
you're
anything.
talking about somebody in particular.
Either. Do you have
Okay.
anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think it's always nice talking with you and
You too?
being with you.
You want to say hi to Mr. Scheid? That's my history teacher.
Oh, hi, Mr. Scheid. I'm happy for you that Nick's in your class. He's a wonderful boy and we love him dearly. Thank you.
So I'll wrap it up. Thank you very much for your time.
You're very welcome. Love you.
Love you too. I'd like to give you a round of applause for your time.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
You did a great
I've
job.
probably forgotten half the things I should say.
It's all good. You taught me a lot, so I just thank you.
you.